Hello and welcome to my first ever recorded lecture. It's the first time I've ever done it. Please bear with me. It'll probably not be as good as the real thing. I'm not sure. Maybe it'll be better. Anyways, you should have your fill in the blank taxonomy and classification notes out in front of you. I encourage you to, write down extra stuff, not just the stuff that's in the blanks. And remember, eventually you will be quizzed on this information, so make sure you're paying attention. So here we go. Here's some standards that go with this unit. We've got ecology. That's just the interaction between living things and their environment. That's what ecology is. And also, we're covering the standard of evolution. Remember, evolution is an important theme in biology, and it really does span the entire year. We'll be talking about it all the time. So, biodiversity. The reason we need to classify things is because there's just so much biodiversity out there. And biodiversity is just, here's the definition, you can write this down in your notes, it's the total amount of variation among life forms within a given ecosystem, biome, or the entire Earth. And so that's the biosphere we're talking about. Any place on the Earth or above the Earth or in the Earth where you can find living things, that's what the biosphere is. Remember, that would include like the inner lining of your nasal passages, a bacteria riding on a speck of dust, 10 miles above the surface of the Earth. That's everywhere. And so why is biodiversity important? Well, the more biodiversity you have, the more stability there is in an ecosystem. We talked about why it's really important to have variation within a species. We don't all look like each other at all. We don't act like each other within our species, and that's extremely healthy because if there's a super bug comes in and starts to wipe out humans, hopefully there's enough diversity within our species that at least some of us will have an immune system that's different enough to survive the new environmental stress. And that would also apply to biodiversity within the biosphere, not just within a species, but among species. So as the planet changes, as it has since the beginning of the planet, there's always going to be different species that are going to survive according to how well adapted they are to the new environment. So the more biodiversity you have, the more chance that at least some living things will survive a major change in the environment. And that would, of course, relate to natural selection and the evolution standard. You can see here, this is a food web, which consists of several interconnected food chains. Here's one food chain. Grass gives its energy to this primary consumer called a grasshopper, which is eaten by a skunk, believe it or not. And maybe that skunk is eaten by a great horned owl. That would be one food chain. And here's another one. The blueberry bush, a producer, is eaten by the skunk, and the skunk gets eaten by a great horned owl again. So food webs are more accurate depictions of feeding relationships in a particular ecosystem, are more accurate than a food chain. There's several food chains in any ecosystem, and this would be an extreme simplification. This wouldn't represent all of the food chains within a woodland. This is just kind of an example of some of them. Okay, so why classify? Well, there's an estimated 1.4 million species described so far. If that doesn't sound like a big number, it is. Probably about 1.5 million bottle caps would fill my classroom, Building 5 at River Valley. So it's a big number, but estimated 5 to 50 million more to go. That is an extremely big range when you think about, the number 1.4 million. That's how many we've got so far, and we're estimating anywhere between 5 and 50 million more. We're just not sure because we're always finding life in new places, and life can be really, really, really small. So think about the fact that there are approximately 10,000 different species of bacteria in just a handful of soil. That's not 10,000 bacteria, but 10,000 different species of bacteria. So there's a lot of life out here. Here's a graph that would show you the number of flora that's producers or autotroph, and fauna, that would be animals in a place called the Caucasus. Notice there's, this break in this line right here. Anytime you have a break in a bar graph, that's representing that this is so much bigger than the rest of them. They couldn't even fit it on the chart. So this is 6350 up here, and these guys, there's about almost 400 species of birds. So there's always going to be way more producers in an ecosystem than there are consumers. So taxonomy, as it says in PowerPoint, is the scientific naming and classifying of organisms. And this guy right here looks a lot like Thomas Jefferson or maybe George Washington. He was around the same time. He is the father of taxonomy, and his name is Carolus Linnaeus. And you can see, you might write down when he was around. This is a period of time called the Enlightenment. This is when a lot of science is just showing up. This is when Ben Franklin is doing his electricity experiment. Joseph Priestley is discovering oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis and isolating just oxygen by itself, which would be a tricky thing to do if you hadn't done it before, being that oxygen's invisible and so is carbon dioxide and nitrogen and other stuff. So this is a pretty important period of time when people are taking a very close look at the scientific method, and there's important discoveries in biology, chemistry, physics. Yeah, it's just an explosion in science. So this is Carolus Linnaeus. He's a pretty crazy guy. He was so into classifying things that he actually renamed himself. He was originally Carl von Linné, and he was so into this that he gave himself a two-part scientific name and changed his name officially to Carolus Linnaeus, which he Latinized his name. Very funny. The reason he did this is before he developed his system of binomial nomenclature, which is where every organism gets a two-part scientific name. Scientists use these polynomials. So if you wrote a scientific paper about the honeybee, every time you referred to this animal, you would have had to write apis pubescent thorace subgrecio abdomine fusco pedibus postis glabrous intricae margine ciliatus, which, each one of these names in the many-name polynomial is just a descriptor for a different part of the honeybee. This probably means, little hairs on the margin of its abdomen, something like that. But, and different scientists looking at the same organism would give it different big, long polynomials. Linnaeus came in and said, hey, we're not doing that anymore. We're just going to call this organism from now on Apis mellifera, and that's what we call it today. It's a two-part name. Apis is the first part, and mellifera is the second part. So how to write a scientific name is pretty important. You'll see this on the next quiz. The genus name is always capitalized. A species name, the second part, is lowercase, so Apis was capitalized, mellifera was all lowercase. Everything, the first part and the second part, both get underlined. And or you can also use italics. You can't really write in italics. It's not the same thing as cursive. So we'll all just underline our scientific names. And you might ask what language is used, or I used to ask this when we were in class, and the answer is Latin. And why would they use Latin? Because Latin's a dead language. Nobody uses it anymore, which is great for scientific things. Because when's the last time you said, "Wherefore art my pencil"? You just don't talk that way anymore. Now we just say, "Yo, where's my pencil at?" And that's English today. So it's a really good idea to use Latin because it's unchanging. It never will change because nobody speaks it, not even in Latin America. So our scientific name is Homo sapiens. We all are firmly placed here. This is the genus name, Homo, so we are all in the genus Homo, and we all share the specific epithet sapiens. So if I asked you what your genus was, you would tell me Homo. If I asked you what species you belong to, you wouldn't say sapiens. You would say properly Homo sapiens is our species name. The specific epithet by itself isn't good enough because there are other genuses which might also have a specific epithet called sapiens. For example, Felis domesticus and Canis domesticus could be two different genuses with the same specific epithet. So taxonomy solves the problem of common names. And so this little kitty right here, you might call a mountain lion. That's usually what we call it out here. If you're in the southeast United States, you would probably call it a cougar or a puma. Panther in some places. Down here, this is a sycamore tree. In Australia, I believe they call it a plane tree. It's called a buttonwood tree someplace else. And so scientific names, this guy, everybody, no matter where you live, if you're writing a scientific paper, you would call this animal Felis concolor, whether you're in Japan, whether you're in Peru, whether you're in the southeast or the southwest, you're going to call this Felis concolor. You're going to capitalize the genus name and lowercase this specific epithet. And this buttonwood tree is Platanus occidentalis. So taxonomy, if we all agree on one name, that's a good thing, because you might not know that a panther is also a puma and the same thing as a mountain lion. Okay, so looking at this question here, we've got these cute little guys. Don't let them fool you. This bear right here and this bear would eat you. This guy wouldn't. So what are the scientific names of the polar bear, Ursus maritimus, grizzly bear, Ursus arctos, and giant panda, Alyrupoda melanaluca? Tell you about their similarity to each other. And I'll let you think about that for a second. And I would say probably the best answer to that is the grizzly bear and the polar bear have to be more closely related by evolution because they're sharing the same genus, Ursus arctos and Ursus maritimus. And the panda bear must be at least different enough to give him this genus. In fact, we don't even call them panda bears because they're not really bears, even though they kind of look like bears. Their dentition and digestive tract makes them look a lot different, so we put them in their own species. So because they share the same genus, these two would be more closely related by evolution. Okay, Linnaeus's hierarchical system for, naming organisms or classifying organisms. Notice it is a hierarchy, and this diagram is showing you there's 5 kingdoms of life. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this particular one would be the kingdom Animalia. Within this kingdom, kingdom Animalia, remember there's plants, there's funguses, there's protists, and there's bacteria. Those are the other kingdoms. Just looking at the kingdom Animalia, within that kingdom, there are several lower classifications or smaller classifications at the phylum level, which is still a very large classification group. The phylum level, most of these phyla would contain invertebrates. Invertebrates don't have backbones. There's one phylum of vertebrates called Chordata, and that means that you have a backbone, believe it or not. Or actually you have a notochord, which is usually inside a backbone. And so this diagram is saying, hey, it's a hierarchy. This is the biggest classification. Within these bigger classifications, you have several smaller classifications. So let's look within the phylum, kingdom Animalia. Phylum Chordata puts us in this box. This box expanded shows us that below the phylum level, within each phylum are several classes. And this organism is in the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, and in the class Mammalia. And any organism in the class Mammalia would have similar characteristics. which we'll talk about, and I'm going to go to part 2 of this lecture. See you in a bit.